Welcome to Journeys and Journals. We're on the road. Well, on the trail. Meet the Applegate family historian. And we're going on the Oregon Trail to start with.
Correct.
Welcome, Leta. Leta Neiderheiser, and what's the other names?
Oh, in terms of my book, Leta Lovelace Neiderheiser is what I used. Lovelace was my maiden name. And of course, I am a descendant of Jessie Applegate, great-great-granddaughter.
And this is the trail they first followed?
That would be the Oregon Trail, and which they came over in 1843. Jessie was the captain of what was known as the cow column, because the Great Migration of 1843 had over 1,000 souls in it, split a couple of weeks out of Independence, Missouri because of loose cattle, and a lot of the people resented all those loose cattle, so those with loose stock went into one train. It was considered to be the slower column, but Jessie was a good enough wagon master that it was never more than 2 or 3 days behind the fast, and on several occasions ahead of the fast train.
And what is this?
Well, this is actually not on the Oregon Trail. It's on the Applegate Trail after the Applegates arrived in Oregon in 1843. In 1846, a call came out to find a southern route into Oregon, and Jessie ended up being the captain of that. This is a place over in Nevada, actually, where the trail goes, where they had to lower the wagons down a very steep mountain. And this is solid rock, but they had to block off the wheels and put chains on them, and the wheels dragging, but this is where they actually have made grooves into the rock. Doesn't look like much on that picture, but if you're over there and walk it, they're from 8 to 10 inches deep, where the wagons just wore the rocks away as they lowered them down that hill.
And you're talking the Applegate Trail,
I'm talking
and
the
that's
Applegate
your family.
Trail, and that's true.
Now, in that trail walk, some people brought just necessities, right?
Well, most of them started out with a little bit more than necessities, but by
Okay.
the time they got here, they didn't have much more than that.
So this teapot, or the likes of it, beautiful teapot, might have been packed up by Grandma carefully.
And a few of them did make it.
Yeah, that's where my story comes in, because there was one lady who had a cord around her waist, and she says, I'll carry it all the way to Utah, because I don't want to leave my teapot behind. It was a beautiful teapot, I'm sure, very much like yours. What kind of things did your family bring west?
Well, they certainly, Jessie was really into books, so they carried a few books, more than most would have, and when they had to begin to jettison things, and they truly did not throw away as much as many other people did. For one thing, they had, I believe, 3 wagons rather than just one, so it gave them a little bit more space to carry things. And actually in 1843, the first group that came over the Oregon Trail, until they got to the Columbia River, really did not have the problems that a lot of them coming behind. They did have some, but not near as much, and didn't really have to throw out as much as some other. And now the Applegate Trail, the first year, that's a whole different story.
Tough times.
Tough times.
But the pot would have been very important.
Oh yes, they certainly would have kept cooking pots if there was, because you know, that's how you cooked. And it may have been just one for everything you did, but a cooking pot and a frying pan, I pretty much can guarantee you they held on to.
They did. Well, mine's been around a few years, but hasn't traveled the trail. You've got pictures of the trail.
Now, these again are out on the Applegate Trail. That's down below Goose Lake a little bit. That particular picture I took because if you read some of the journals about the Applegate Trail, they talk about the fact that they walked all day and their feet never touched the ground, and you're going, huh? What's that all about? Well, you get out there and you see this ground is just covered with black lava rock. Enough of it so you really do walk all day without your feet touching the ground. But the thing I found most interesting about that lava rock is that I had on fairly heavy boots, and yet at the end of the day, walking over that, the bottom of my feet were raw. And yet when the women and children got that far west, the men's boots tended to be heavier and they lasted better. But often the women and children, by the time they reached that, were barefoot because they'd worn their shoes out. I cannot even imagine walking on that lava rock barefoot.
Oh my goodness. Mm. And the reason they walked and didn't ride?
Well, number one, the wagon would have been full of your belongings to a certain extent. And number two, I went on a reenactment of the Oregon Trail out in Nebraska one time, and that wagon bumps around, and Nebraska is relatively mild country. It bumps around so much that you get real tired of it real quick. And then if for whatever reason you needed to get out in a hurry, you can't get out of it very quick. So basically they walked.
And if you happened to be inside, it probably would be pretty hot.
And I'm sure it got very hot. They did tend to, once they were in good weather, they rolled the sides up so that you did have some air. But nonetheless, basically the only people that rode was the driver, and possibly if you were sick or an invalid or something of that nature.
Or just had a baby. I
Maybe
understand
just
you
had
got
a
a
baby.
day or so.
But most of the time you walked.
And if you are having a baby, the wagon train didn't stop.
In 1843, with Marcus Whitman, Dr. Whitman was with them. His policy was that he did pull the wagon away, stop the wagon where the woman was, and pull it away. The rest of the train would go on. Most people really frowned on that, but and it seemed to work for him. And then they'd kind of have a little privacy, and she'd have her baby, and then they'd catch back up with the rest of the train.
Loved it. I want to tell you here about when they actually got here to the west and started families. You said they started building, but the first year must have been a primitive.
Actually, Jesse at one point says that it was more primitive out here than it even had been when the first colonists had came to the East Coast, because they came from a ship, did have some supplies on the ship, and knew that the ship was returning to England and would be back with supplies. Where you came out here, probably used up or lost most of your supplies coming, and there was nothing here.
You had to have your food, your animals' food. You had to have your tools, or you'd be in trouble once you got here.
And a lot of them lost most of that. And so you basically came and started from, you ended up here in the late fall, early winter, so you couldn't get a crop growing, and you couldn't go to the store and buy supplies. You had to build whatever you lived in. It was very primitive. In fact, that first year, the women used the covers off their wagons, if they were lucky enough to still have them, to make basically like outer garments for their families. The men tended to dress in buckskin, but it stunk, so they didn't like it.
And little girls would look a lot like this.
Yes.
Oh, I almost think the face was dirty. But it would have been, wouldn't it? And my apron would have been just in. The reason for aprons?
Well, you were lucky if you had a change of clothes. You may have only had one, two, if you were lucky, dresses, and an apron was one way of covering it up, keeping it somewhat clean.
Yeah, because you can wash
the apron easier than you could the whole garment, or maybe you had 2 or 3 aprons and one apron got dirty and you just covered it up with another. But
they had to have blankets and what in the world did they do for diapers and women's?
It was very challenging, to say the least.
And water on the way? How did they get water?
Well, that was part of the wagon master's job, was to lay the route out so that certainly at noon and in the evening that they camped where there was water. It wasn't always possible, certainly on the Applegate Trail when they came across the Black Rock Desert out in Nevada. That's 35 miles of nothing in the way of water. But they tended to try and lay out the trail so that every 15 miles there was water. And you could carry a little in barrels in your wagon, and of course that's part of the reason the trail got so hard in years after the first year, is the water supplies began to become polluted because of the animals and the people. And so cholera and things of that nature were a problem as the trail went on, not in the first couple of years, but as the years went on, then disease became more of a problem on the trail.
Oh, when you think back about that, Aren't you proud of our pioneers?
They were hardy Stark. There's no denying it. Some more than others, but they were very capable.
Now we're talking these two folk.
Uh-huh.
They've been married for
Well,
10 or more years
yeah,
before they
certainly.
head west.
Yes.
So they had to be an agreement. Did they have children by that time?
They certainly did. They had 8 children when they started west.
In 10 years?
Well, the Applegates were pretty, when they first arrived in Oregon, and by then they've already lost, Jesse and Cynthia have lost a child while they were in Missouri. They lose, of course, Robert on the Columbia River. Between the Applegates, shortly after they arrived here, they had 24 children under the age of 14 between the 3 brothers.
Prolific.
And they definitely go ahead to have more children after they're here. In the end, Cynthia has 13 children, raises 9 of her grandchildren.
Because?
Her daughter Roselle, at 29 with 8 children, dies of TB. And 4 years later, her daughter Gertrude also dies of TB, leaving 1 son. Now, Gertrude is something that, and when I started out to do this research, I thought I knew her story, and I didn't. Gertrude, at 15, had been raised pretty much there in the Yoncalla Valley, pretty isolated. Schooling had just been a little country school, but she was sent up to Bethel in Polk County to a school to live with a reverend and his wife. Before she left home, her dad said, and mother said to her, "You're 15, do not keep company with any young man, you're too young." And she's supposed to stay with the minister and his wife about a mile from the school. The minister's wife decides that walking back and forth to school in the winter in the rain is too much, so she puts Gertrude into town to live with her son, who is a lawyer. And of course, she meets a whole different type of people living with the son than she would have at the minister's house. And one of the young men she meets is a James D. Fay. He was a young lawyer, a native of South Carolina, evidently a real good talker, and a little older than Gertrude. And he is a successionist. He believes in slavery, which Jesse was totally opposed to. He actually was a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh.
And anyway, the word comes home to Jesse that Gertrude and James are seeing each other. He immediately has her come home, telling her she is not old enough or smart enough to decide who to marry. And she informs him, well, my sister was 15 when she married, and my Aunt Betsy was 15 when they married. And her father says, well, yes, they shouldn't have. They were too young, but at least they married decent men, and the man you're looking at is not a decent man. So he assumes once he brings her home that she'll forget him, and more importantly, that he will forget her and move on, find somebody else. What he doesn't know is that over the next period of time, and this is what I didn't know, it's 1856 when she goes off to school. And over the next 9 years, she secretly, through the help of friends, Mary Drain in Drain, helps her continue to communicate with him. And he'll come down to Drain, and she goes and they meet. And finally, in October of 1864, so we're talking from 56 to 64, one morning she gets on the stage that stops at her father's house and runs off to marry James. They live he's a lawyer down in Jacksonville here. Her father is absolutely, totally devastated.
Eloped with the enemy.
And this is during, now we're in the middle of the Civil War. A couple of her brothers have gone off to fight in the war, and she has eloped with absolutely the enemy as far as Jesse's concerned. He takes a penknife and cuts her name out of the Bible, family Bible. Writes to Judge Deedy saying, what can I do to make sure she is disinherited? She is to get nothing. Even if her body was to be brought home, she will never be allowed to be buried in the family cemetery.
That's real vindictive.
He
isn't
is
it?
really upset about this. That's the most, I don't see any other place in his history where he behaves quite this way.
Now, how'd you find that
Oh,
out?
well, a lot of letters and different things, digging through them. But then she continues to try and communicate, particularly with her mother. But she doesn't succeed. The letters are never, I don't know what, I think probably Jesse received them and just didn't allow them to be read. I don't know for certain. She does communicate with a couple of cousins and Mary Drain. One thing that she wants her mother to know is evidently the rumor became when she ran off that she was pregnant. And she wants her mother to know that is absolutely not true. But she does, about a year later, have a little baby boy.
Have you ever met descendants from that family?
Well, it's a sad story that ends.
Oh.
But anyway, she then becomes ill. She gets TB.
Oh.
By now, James is in the state legislature as a representative from Jacksonville. He's gone a lot, not really in the mood to care for a sick wife. She wants desperately to go home, writes to her mother and begs, and at this part actually to a cousin who goes to Cynthia, begs to come home. Cynthia convinces Jesse to allow her to come home, but he makes that she can come, but that her husband absolutely cannot. That traitor will not be allowed in my house. When they come on the stage, Cynthia rushes out to meet at the stage, invites James in too, and as Gertrude is carried into the house, she says to her father, "Papa, I have came home to die." And he says, "Oh no, you have came home for your mother to nurse you back to her health." She then asks that her sisters and nieces come and gather around her bed and sing some hymns. James then asks, who taught them to sing so beautifully? And she says, "I did." Then she asks that everybody leave the room and that her father come in, and they spend a couple of hours talking. Jesse never shared what they talked about. And the next morning she dies. And she is buried in the family cemetery.
Oh. Well, that's a little bit of good news.
I got a feeling that perhaps that wasn't the happiest marriage, because I did find a letter. I was told I could not use it in the book, but the letter indicates that she wants desperately to come home and for one last time to be among people who love her and to be at peace. So that kind of indicates to me that perhaps the marriage was not as happy as it might have been.
And the child? Do we know about
James,
the child?
he did live, he came and lived. Cynthia and Jesse did raise him. Well, actually their son Robert raised him. But both James Fay Sr. and the boy end up later in their lives committing suicide.
What a serious, heartbreaking
The father
story.
does, and some years later the son does.
The only son.
The only
Now,
son.
how many, I was lucky enough to go to the reunion, the family reunion. Hey, what's this tale all about back here?
Oh, it was to protect your neck from the sun and bugs, and of course your neck's fairly sensitive, and walking in all day in the sun and working out in your garden or whatever, that was to protect your neck from becoming sunburned, and then also from bugs, mosquitoes, flies, whatever.
Yeah, and this could be pulled down a little closer, couldn't it, like yours?
Certainly, you could, to shade your face or whatever,
Yeah.
and sometimes they turned them back, but mainly the idea, of course, a lady in those days, she wouldn't have thought of being tan. That was just the working class, or the, well, certainly, it just wasn't something a lady did, was get all tan.
So you'd protect, so likely your dress is more appropriate for walking across America in the middle of the summer.
They did all this long sleeves to protect their arms from the bugs, from the sun. Yeah, most all of them wore long sleeves.
Where can I learn more?
Well, from reading my book, among other things.
Jesse Applegate. This is a fantastic new book, but our the libraries, the Applegate Museum, what about that? Have
The
you
Applegate
been there?
Museum has them. Wolf Creek has them. Of course, Oregon Books here locally. Douglas County Museum. Actually, I just sent some to the Oregon State Capitol's gift shop. So there's lots of places you can get it, and libraries do have it.
And they would have come through Washington State, and now with the Applegate Trail, they come through California.
They do. Well, in terms of Washington State, they really just came right up here to the corner, and then they came down the Columbia River. They didn't go in. Of course, Washington State didn't exist, or did Oregon. We were just the Oregon Territory.
And the Oregon Territory included a whole lot.
Like Oregon, Washington, parts of Idaho, parts of Montana even.
What was the out west, and we were still not sure what country we were going to go
absolutely
on to.
not. When the pioneers came in 1843, we were under joint occupation of the British and the Americans from the War of 1812. It had been left under a joint occupation. Part of the reason that the settlers came was with the idea that the more Americans out here, the better the chance that it would be the question would be resolved in the Americans' favor.
You've got any insight into women's work? I mean, Jesse's out doing this surveying.
Yeah, once they were here, he was gone a lot of the time, and here's Cynthia at home with, anywhere from 12 to 20 kids to look after. Of course, by then, quite a few of them were fairly grown up, but nonetheless, and she ran a small dairy. She had dairy cows. I've bred up to 40 at one time. Of course, she had all that they had orchards. You had to do all that canning and, keep a garden. I can't even begin, and just keeping washing and things. And she had sheep that she sheared and made wool. Didn't make wool, but spun wool.
Sounds like kids learned to work early, too.
I think they did. And from every indication, Jesse's children were hard workers. His daughter Sally, in a letter that I read, indicated that their father was really a very easygoing father. They had chores. You were expected to do them. He spoke one time, told you to do something one time, and you were absolutely expected to do it, and they did. But he also gave them a great deal of freedom. If their chores were done and their schoolwork was done, they pretty much could roam and do what they wanted to do. Most of them were very talented musicians, so spent a fair amount of time, I'm sure. And they had big gatherings at their home where all of them played musical instruments, big dances and parties upstairs. In their big house that they built in Yoncalla, they had a room upstairs that was...
Well, we can't go to that Yoncalla home.
No, it's gone. I share in the book that he foolishly signed, when Oregon first became a state, couldn't borrow money because we had no credit rating, so you had to have bondsmen signed for the first Secretary of State. It was somebody that Jesse knew.
And trusted.
Trusted totally. He agreed to sign the bond, and the man embezzled funds, and he was never held accountable for it. May was never held accountable, but Jesse, as the bondsman, lost everything he owned over it.
I bet you some people here can relate to that in these hard times, Nothing you might have done caused the hard times to come. They just were there.
They just were. And Jesse had a beautiful home built, it was called the most beautiful home in Southern Oregon of the time, and lost it to the state.
We're talking Yoncalla.
Yoncalla, it was in Yoncalla.
Now, I was in Yoncalla recently, and I went to this grocery store, and it's really the main part of town, painted beautifully with
which one you're talking about.
And then the farm for which family is it just outside of town where the reunion was held?
That's at Charles. That's the older brother.
And Charles's home is open for school kids.
Yes,
I just love that.
Shannon has made a real effort. Shannon Applegate, of course, Skookum is the book that many people are familiar with that she wrote. She has made a real effort to make the home open. When you go there, like the drum, you could touch that. The musical instruments, one of the nephews made beautiful violins, and I was just there recently with the Oregon Historical Advisory Council for Oregon Historic Trails. And one of the gentlemen just couldn't believe that he could handle those violins and all the books that Jesse had sent around the Horn for his library. You can actually touch them.
And when you're there, there's the girls' side of the house and the boys' side of the house, and they did entertain a lot.
Now, Charles didn't entertain near as much as Jesse did. However, the parties would be held at Jesse, and then the young men in particular would go over to Charles, because Jesse did not allow any kind of alcoholic beverage on his property. And that wasn't true over at Charles. And the gold miners, when the people went back and forth to the gold fields, the miners would stay at Charles's house.
It seems there was kind of a wall.
There was.
Girls' side, boys' side.
There was very definitely, that house had a women's side and a men's side. That's a long story. I don't have time to tell.
Oh, shucks.
But when the miners would come, they would come and sleep on the floor in the men's side. And they came there because there was always alcoholic beverages available. And then when they'd get up and leave, the girls would sweep the floor and pick up the gold dust, and that's how they got. You were never charged at any Applegate house to stay the night or for food. They didn't believe in that. But the girls got paid in their own way, because they would sweep the floor the next day and get the gold dust. And then also there was a sugar bowl that went with a tea set, and it was set on the table. And the miners often would put a pinch of gold in that. And that was called, and became known as the Oregon dollar.
A pinch of gold. I love it. That's
and
a total.
The girls liked when the big men came, because their pinches of gold would be bigger.
Oh, folks, thank you so much for tuning in today and for meeting my friend Leta. And the Applegate story is available, and it's just been a thrill to have you here.
Thank you.
And God bless America and God bless Oregon.
Yes, absolutely.
It's been well worth the struggle to come west.
Oh, they felt that way. They did. They had a lot of real hard struggles after they were here, but felt very strongly that it was worth the effort.
Thank you again, Leta. I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying bye for now.